Eliot Whittington, who's the director of the Corporate Leaders Groups, one of Women in Business Coalition's partners. Eliot has been the driving force behind Climate Leadership Now, our new guide that looks to raise the bar on corporate climate ambition. He's here to answer any questions you might have about the guide and the discussion that you probably just listened into with a range of the coalition partners talking about its content. We'll wait for a few questions to come in from those of you who have just joined. But to kick us off, Eliot, Women in Business has obviously been pushing companies to lead on climate since the Paris Agreement, when we came together, or even before the Paris Agreement. So why is now the moment to raise the bar on what we're asking companies to do on climate?
Well, I think there were three big reasons that really stood out. So the first being, just acknowledging the huge body of business leadership that we are standing on, and the fact that in many ways that means some of the things that we held up as leadership back in 2014 and 2015 feel like, no, that's not leadership, that's just the way of doing business. That should just be out there. And actually the real front runners, all the amazing stories that we've been able to hear this week show a new kind of leadership. So we're wanting to document that story. That was one thing. I think another thing is that as we've embarked on that journey, we've become, our understanding of what the decarbonisation journey looks like has become that much richer and deeper. And so to try and capture some of that, to try and capture some of these stories about how the just transition needs to be at the heart of it, how you need to think about the action across your supply chain, those kind of things. And then I suppose the third thing, the thing that we can't ignore, is just how, the reality of systemic risk has come and become part of all our lives this year. And, the pandemic is a kind of clear part of the context, and to sort of say, well, actually, there could have been questions about, should climate leadership be a thing now? We should be focusing on something else. And the response that we're getting from the business community is the opposite. It's like, we can see that this is critical, this is important. We can see the risk if you let these problems go under address. We want to be part of this story. So I think for all of these reasons, it felt like the story that we've been telling for 5 years needed to be brought together and taken to the next level, and that's what we've very much tried to do.
Thanks, Eliot. And I think I remember when COVID first did break, we did have conversations around whether or not we should in fact have a conversation about climate leadership now in that context. We've just heard from Mindy, the CEO of Ceres, in the previous broadcast, and she talked quite a lot about advocacy and how important companies raising their voices are from a leadership perspective. We've had real success led by the Corporate Leaders Group this week in the EU, 170 companies calling for raised ambition. Why do you think so many companies got behind the call to push the European Union to raise its ambition?
I mean, it was just to firstly say it was really exciting and pleasing to be part of that, and the fact that we did get such success, and to note what that's, the fact that success is what it is, because I've been working with the Corporate Leaders Group for over a decade. We've been championing European targets throughout that time. That's what we do, stronger targets, as well as kind of engaging with all sorts of other conversations. And the journey from, the core members of the group pushing for a 2030 target of 40%, saying it must be higher than that, which was before Paris, to last year we got over 50 companies joining the group, joining the core group members, saying we need a climate neutrality target. And then this year getting 150 and still climbing, they're still signing up. And for a target which is very much in the kind of immediate term in terms of what we need to deliver. So this is very much, what are the policies that are going to be introduced now? I think that is really inspiring. For me, it comes to the fact that this point about, climate leadership, it has become more mainstream. And this is reflected in the policy world, that Europe's kind of core mainstream economic policy is the European Green Deal, which is also its climate policy. These two things are coming together. And I think the businesses that we work with who are furthest ahead on the leadership story absolutely recognise that. They recognise that this is not a kind of off to the side agenda that they can deal with and then go back to the day job. This is core to the future of their business. This is a mainstream strategic question, and that's why they need to be part of this story.
Thanks. Again, go ahead.
I was going to say, clearly we've got a bit. I know there's a question from Danielle. Should I pick that up?
Yes, do. So Danielle is asking, do you think we should accept variations in the standards of leadership from different countries of operation?
I think you've got to accept that business operation and leadership exists within a context. But you've also got to think about the fact that, I think what we've tried to do with climate leadership now is set out a story of leadership that can be applied globally, that is a relevant one. And then I think there's something very much about, so the first section, ambition, we've really clearly marked out that ambition needs to be informed by the science. And that, the science doesn't vary, and it's non-negotiable. If we don't provide sufficient action and activity, that we are putting forward solutions that are commensurate with the scale of the problem, then the problem's not going to go away. We're not going to deal with it. And then people, in return, you're going to get pressure back to say the action needs to go further. So this is partly due to this, the success of things like science-based targets, to say wherever you are, whatever you're doing, you need to take note of the science. And just one other thing on that, a classic example of this, if I think back to the debates we had sort of 10 years ago when the climate talks were in Copenhagen, was like, well, is China doing enough? Where should China be? And where is they? They've obviously just come forward to put the same sort of goal as Europe, net zero. They're saying 10 years later that they've got that many more people in poverty, that much further to go. That seems to me to be reasonable. Great if both blocks could do it faster. But some analysts, economic analysts that we work with here in Cambridge, have been looking into that, and they say that if China delivers on its 2060 net zero target, China will be far richer than if it does otherwise. Often when we talk about different contexts, there's this kind of sort of sense of, in poorer countries they don't have as much resource and they can't afford this. Well, actually, can they afford not to do this? A lot of these is about building the new opportunities, the new markets, the future, and those who move first and fastest will often be those who benefit most.
Absolutely, thanks, Eliot. We have a question from Bill Westcott in the chat as well, focused on circular economy. So I'll read what Bill has to ask us. What should be done to elevate the role of the circular economy in advancing climate goals, particularly in the US, where circular economy is not well known yet and has great potential for green jobs and economic development?
It's a really good question. I mean, I think you're right. The circular economy, we need to talk about it more and focus on it. Partly, I think we need to all get better at really identifying what the big at-scale circular economy stories and ideas are. So I think, there are some great practices out there, and there is some really good framing. But because there aren't, if we compare it to something like renewable energy, where, we know what it looks like, I don't think circular economy has yet got the same immediacy in the story. But we're missing a trick, as you say. It's through circularity we can start to create jobs that are exactly those kind of jobs that we need. Often they're not jobs that are where people aren't. They're jobs where people are, because if you want to repair things, if you want to build circular systems, you need to go where the economic activity is, which is where the people are. So huge opportunity there, and it improves efficiency. So it's really useful in terms of generating further economic growth. And it's particularly key because I think one of the things that we're more and more addressing as we talk about that granular story is the need to transition sectors like steel and cement, very hard to abate sectors. And the technical solutions are out there, but they're not necessarily, all of those solutions are necessarily cheap. And if we can be much more efficient with how we use resources like that through circularity, it's just going to make that process of change that much easier. So a really important topic.
Thanks, Eliot. I can see James is just typing a question into the chat. But while we wait for that, just to jump back to your point on the huge leaps forward from China, somewhat unexpected and surprising lots of quarters, and the EU. Why are such ambitious sort of statements of intent from big major economies important from a business perspective?
Well, the conversation I've had with, I think it's actually particularly important to think about this sort of the net zero climate neutral story. I think there's something really clear and clean about that story. And we've been talking to businesses for, I'm going to say 7 or 8 years about it, where when the story was about targets and it was about percentage reductions and how many more percentages, then there's always a sense of, we're in a low carbon story, and there's always the sort of sense of actually, well, if I reduce this percent and that percent, then it's a little bit better, and is that good enough, and all that kind of thing. And I'm going to have this that I can't reduce, but that's okay, because there's a bit left. The zero carbon story is different. The zero carbon story is like, well, all the things that we can do that reduce emissions need to be done very clearly. And it also says, if you're doing something that's a bit better, but it's not putting you on the track to a deep decarbonisation pathway, to a zero carbon story, then it's not good enough. So it's been really clarifying, I think, for a lot of business strategies. It's also been incredibly useful as a signal from government about where they think the economy is going. It cuts through in a way that some of the kind of like, we're going to do sort of 30% by this point and 40% at that point have not been able to do in the same way. So I think that's been incredibly powerful. And we very much talk in climate leadership now about this idea of a vision for the future, where you're saying, where things are going. And I think that's something that needs to come from government as well as from business. But obviously the critical thing is, once you've got that vision, you're turning it into shorter term actions and plans that are actually operational.
Brilliant. Thank you. It does a lot to set the context for business to continue to innovate if they're clear on the direction of travel from a government perspective. Question in from James. So huge momentum from business on action on climate. It's really encouraging. But we also live in a world of increasing polarization. Obviously, impossible to ignore that. And brewing culture wars. How can we make sure businesses bring their workers and customers with them on the journey to net zero?
I think that's an incredibly good question, an incredibly challenging question, actually. I mean, we did put very clearly in the advocacy piece that one of the areas that is potentially under-discussed is how business can use its public communications capacity, its marketing and advertising capacity, to make sure that it is telling a better story about some of this stuff. And I think that there is a lot more that we can think about in some of those things. I note that there's been some interesting stuff recently, like Facebook putting up a kind of climate knowledge resource in it. I also think actually there are increasingly companies who have used their public persona to tell a good story. I think where we need to shift, though, is that needs to, again, it's this kind of journey that is maybe a thread throughout this story of some of those examples are the kind of examples that we like to highlight, and those need to move from being, isn't this a great example of doing things in a different way, or a company stepping out from others, to being the mainstream. And to some extent, I mean, you talk about culture wars and polarization. I think some of this stuff is a story of ideas where we need to win, but a lot of it is about behaviors and options. And I think, if you think, for example, about the diet piece, there are so many reasons why people might want to think about their diet. And obviously one of the things is, if we get people to eat a bit less animal protein, then that will be hugely useful in terms of reducing our overall carbon footprint. And you can tell that story in terms of carbon, but you can also tell that story in terms of animal welfare, and you can also tell that story in terms of health, and you can also tell that story in terms of, look at all the exciting new products that will give you kind of a different way of, a different diet that you might want to choose. So, and personally, haven't had this conversation with others, I think actually it's about making sure that we are modeling, demonstrating and convincing people of the behaviors that they need to take, so they're on that journey with us, and cutting across that polarization, rather than trying to convince every single person in the world that they need to live a net zero life, and they need to kind of have that mindset and have mastered the IPCC and understood the climate science and the implications of it all.
Thanks, Eliot. There's another element to that question, which I'm sure any of our colleagues in the B team would sort of jump on, which is this piece around workers and the way that it connects into the just transition, which is probably a major blind spot for the climate movement overall. So I don't know if you can share a bit about what we say about just transition in climate leadership now, but also how critical it is for us to really address the climate crisis without leaving vast swathes of major economies behind.
Absolutely. And I mean, you're right to mention the B team and also BSR have both done a lot of work on this, and particularly the B team's got some deep partnership with the labour movement and bringing it forward insight from that side. And I'm going to talk a little bit about my personal, some of the things that I've been involved in that have plugged into that conversation as a way of just informing it as well. I think, well, firstly to say, why we absolutely have to talk about it, that if we are in this journey leaving people behind, we are storing up opponents of the change that we need. And that's very clear. So, you know, and we're making it a story that people think is something that they won't want to be part of. So I think that's really important. And I also think that there is something about by engaging with communities, being part of the listening to their workers, being part of thinking about how the different impacts can happen, companies can do a much more thoughtful and positive way of moving some of this story forward. So I think that's really important. The thing I wanted to mention in terms of work that we've done that I think is important is we have to remember that this is one part of a broader change story. So another piece, for example, is the huge impact of new technology and digitalization, which is completely reshaping the workforce. And of course, we are living through another moment with the pandemic, which is also not for everybody, but for a large number of people having a massive impact in terms of how they work. So I think too often we talk about the climate story and jobs and inclusion as if it's the only thing that's happening. And if we take a step back and we think about, well, air quality, we think about where the costs are, we look at the implications of new technologies, we will see that some industries are just going to change. And actually, the analysis that we've worked on with the Corporate Leaders Group and others has shown that the really positive thing here is that a lot of the climate actions create jobs where a lot of these other trends are destroying them. So the world is polarizing. Globalization, digitalization is destroying jobs in the middle. So it's leaving kind of very low skilled jobs and very high skilled jobs, and it's meaning the low skilled jobs are much worse paid. A lot of the jobs that kind of are created by investments in the climate space, because they're new industries, they are much more in the kind of mid-skilled, they're often in different geographic locations. So they are providing jobs for exactly the people who are being left hanging by other trends.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm just wondering if Sam has his question in. I could see he was typing, but it looks like we're probably not going to get there in time. So I'm going to just wrap up with a final question, just because we've got a few minutes. Has it come in? Let's check. No, sorry, Sam. So I guess
Oh yeah, here it is.
Oh, is it? Sorry, here we are. So as this movement becomes more mainstream, the companies making commitments are often those with a mixed record on the issues you've covered today. And where does the balance sit between bringing as many companies as possible on the journey and then restricting to pure companies? I mean, something we discuss behind closed doors at the coalition all the time. What's your view, Eliot?
Well, that's a nice question to finish with.
2 minutes.
I think it's a really important question. And I think, you know, I'm just going to point to a couple of things. One is that no company is free of skeletons in the closet. So I think I would absolutely kind of, you know, not want us to be in a position where we're saying this company is really good and this company is really bad, and just expecting that those two things, you know, this kind of black and white polarized world. Clearly, there are companies who are involved in things that, you know, as a whole, there are companies who I would question whether they've got a future in a kind of modern zero carbon economy. And I think that there are really big challenges there. But yet we do have to take it as useful. You know, the more companies that choose to source renewable energy or who choose to contribute to the demand for electric vehicles, and the more companies that are embarked on a journey towards a net zero economy, that is good, and we should be noting and celebrating that. And I think in different parts of this movement, it's a big movement, there are different bars and challenges. So within the Corporate Leaders Group, we have our own membership criteria, and not every company would be eligible to join. But also, it's important that there are other parts of the movement who are talking to some of the most difficult companies and saying, actually, how do we get you from where you are to being in a better place? Because we do need, ultimately, the whole economy to move.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Eliot. And actually, if you missed the original discussion just before this brief webcast, you'll be able to catch up with it on. It'll go out on the Outrage and Optimism podcast tomorrow, and it probably worth just linking into that sort of piece around really challenging companies. Tom Carnac and Christiana Figueres interviewed the CEO of BP, Bernard Looney, who were really fascinating transition for that company and an intriguing listen. So if you want more on more food for thought on that piece, then suggest tuning in there. In the meantime, you can download the full guide, Climate Leadership Now, from the We Business website. And then it just remains for me to say thank you, Eliot, and thanks everyone for tuning in, and goodbye.
Thank you, everyone.